Marcus Reynolds, a man in his early 40s, had always been a creature of habit. Every morning, long before the sun touched the treetops, he would step out onto the wooden dock of his private lake, feeling the cool mist curl around his ankles. The air smelled faintly of pine, water, and the quiet promise of a day yet to unfold. His property, a sprawling lakeside retreat, had been in his family for generations, a sanctuary where he could escape the relentless pace of the modern world. Marcus was not a man prone to anger. He appreciated the peace, the solitude, the slow rhythm of water lapping against the shore. Yet today, as he opened the latest envelope from the Homeowners Association, HOA, he felt a tension coil tight in his chest. The notice was absurd. You are fined $5,000 for owning too much water. Your reservoir exceeds HOA regulations. Marcus blinked. He read it again. Owning too much water. A private lake, on legally deeded property, regulated by a homeowners group. The sheer ridiculousness of the claim was enough to make him laugh, and then, the injustice of it, to make his blood boil. The HOA had been nitpicking for months, small things at first, complaints about lawn height, dock design, even the color of his mailbox. But this? This was audacious. And he knew exactly who was behind it, Cynthia Whitmore, the HOA president. Elegant, commanding, and bitterly territorial, Cynthia had a way of projecting authority that unnerved even the most confident neighbors. That evening, Marcus attended the HOA's monthly meeting, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. The grand clubhouse, polished and gleaming, smelled of roses and fresh linen. Glass chandeliers sparkled overhead as residents in tailored outfits mingled, sipping champagne and exchanging perfunctory pleasantries. It was garden party day, a tradition that had evolved into a show of influence, wealth, and subtle social warfare. Cynthia stood at the front, orchestrating the meeting with the precision of a conductor. When her gaze landed on Marcus, a faint smirk flickered across her lips. "Marcus," she said, her voice sweet but edged with condescension, "we're only trying to maintain harmony. Imagine the chaos if everyone built private reservoirs." He felt a flash of irritation but kept his composure. Harmony? Or control? The difference was subtle, but he felt it keenly. The meeting continued, a blur of HOA rules, petty disputes, and nodding approval from those who feared crossing the president. Marcus left with his mind spinning, not just with anger, but with the germ of an idea that refused to leave him. The next morning, he walked the perimeter of his property, letting the crisp air and soft light calm his thoughts. The lake stretched before him, calm and undisturbed, as if mocking the petty concerns of the HOA. Marcus felt a spark of rebellion ignite in his chest. They wanted to control his water. Fine. Perhaps it was time they learned the limits of their power. He began quietly observing the terrain, studying water levels, sluice gates, and the dam that had been his family's pride for decades. Each tree, rock, and current became part of a larger mental map. He wasn't planning violence, destruction, or even confrontation, at least, not in the obvious sense. This was about proving a point. And Marcus Reynolds, methodical and clever, believed that nature itself could deliver justice. By evening, he had a plan forming, delicate and precise. The HOA might have authority over community aesthetics, but Marcus held a far older and deeper authority, the law of his own land. And his land, with all its water, was entirely under his control. As the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the lake in shades of orange and gold, Marcus allowed himself a small, private smile. Soon, he would show Cynthia Whitmore, and the entire HOA, that some things, like water, could not be regulated, restrained, or intimidated. They could only be respected, or released. The calm before the storm stretched across the lake, serene and unbroken. But Marcus knew that serenity was deceptive. Every story had its breaking point, and his was fast approaching. Marcus spent the next few days in a quiet but deliberate focus. The absurdity of the fine still lingered in his mind, but he had learned early in life that anger without action was wasted energy. Instead, he turned his frustration into observation and strategy. His property, with its sprawling lawns, private dam, and reservoir, had always been his sanctuary, but now it would become his tool, a silent agent of poetic justice. He started by surveying the land meticulously. The dam, sturdy and old, controlled the flow of the water across the property. Every sluice gate, every notch in the embankment, every curve of the shoreline became a point of potential leverage. Marcus measured water levels at different times of day, charted currents, and noted the subtle ways in which rain and wind affected the reservoir. He was not just planning, he was studying, learning how to let nature itself become his ally. Meanwhile, he observed Cynthia Whitmore with careful attention. Social media gave him access to her world, posts boasting about upcoming parties, meticulously arranged garden events, and gleaming photos of guests enjoying her curated gatherings. Saturday at 3 p.m. was the pinnacle, the garden party she considered the crown jewel of her social calendar. That would be the stage. The plan began to take shape in Marcus' mind like a slow, precise machine. He didn't want chaos for the sake of chaos, he wanted a demonstration of principle. The HOA had tried to dictate the natural boundaries of his land, and now they would witness the power that came with respecting, or ignoring, those boundaries. Marcus worked quietly, making small adjustments to the dam and sluice gates. He had to be careful, too much water too fast could cause real damage, which would undo his moral high ground. The goal was disruption, embarrassment, and a lesson in humility for Cynthia, not destruction. At night, he visualized the event in detail. The sun shining on white tents, crystal glassware glinting in the afternoon light, servers rushing between tables, and Cynthia's face as the first trickle of water touched her perfectly manicured lawn. Each scenario played in his mind, and each time, a small grin formed. The poetic symmetry was irresistible, they fined him for owning too much water, and now that water would attend their event uninvited. Despite the mischievous pleasure, Marcus remained methodical. He checked the safety parameters repeatedly, ensuring pathways were clear, warning wildlife indirectly, and confirming that the water release would not harm anyone physically. This was a moral war as much as a personal one, he would not compromise his integrity. By midweek, he had rehearsed the plan in his mind several times, accounting for weather, guest numbers, and even the positioning of garden furniture. Everything had to be perfect. He felt a thrill in the preparation, a sense of control and anticipation that replaced the initial frustration he had felt at the HOA's audacity. Marcus also began to consider the fallout. The HOA would undoubtedly be outraged, neighbors gossiping, videos spreading online. But Marcus was prepared for that too. His actions were entirely legal, the water was on his land, and the release posed no permanent harm. The HOA's authority could only stretch so far, and he intended to prove that there were limits to their control. One evening, as he walked along the dock, he noticed the reflection of the moon on the water, perfectly still, serene, almost mocking. It was a calm that belied the storm he was about to unleash. Marcus understood that this plan, while playful on one level, carried weight. It was a statement, a boundary set, and a message delivered without words. He chuckled quietly to himself. The irony was delicious. Cynthia Whitmore and the HOA had attempted to assert control over his land, to dictate terms on something they had no claim to. And now, in a few days, that very element, the water, would demonstrate the absurdity of their arrogance. As Saturday approached, Marcus made final preparations. He adjusted the sluice gates one last time, ensuring a controlled release, and checked water levels to time the flow perfectly. The sun rose on Friday morning, casting golden light over the lake, and Marcus felt a calm sense of inevitability. By the time he retired that night, he knew one thing for certain: the garden party would never forget this lesson, and Marcus Reynolds would never have to explain his point with words again. Nature, as always, would do it for him. The calm before the storm was over. Now came the execution. Saturday dawned with a deceptive calm. The lake's surface shimmered under the early morning sun, serene and undisturbed, completely unaware of the chaos that would soon ripple across the community. Marcus Reynolds awoke before first light, as was his habit, and brewed a strong cup of coffee. He stood on the dock, savoring the quiet and letting the golden reflections dance on the water. Today, he thought, the lake would speak for him. The HOA's garden party was scheduled for 3 p.m. sharp. Marcus had timed everything with military precision. The sluice gates of his dam were set to release a controlled surge, just enough to encroach on Cynthia Whitmore's carefully curated lawn without causing real harm. It was, in every way, an elegant plan, a lesson delivered by nature itself. By late morning, Marcus watched from a ridge overlooking the community, binoculars in hand. Guests began arriving in sleek cars, their conversations light and oblivious. Servers adjusted white tablecloths, trays of champagne balanced expertly, and Cynthia flitted from table to table, her smile practiced and flawless. She had no idea that her meticulously planned afternoon was about to unravel. Marcus's fingers hovered over the lever of the sluice gate, a symbol of the control he had over his own land and, momentarily, the fates of the overconfident. A soft smile crept across his face. The first trickle of water moved smoothly through channels he had monitored for days, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. No one noticed. Then, slowly, the edge of the garden began to glisten. Shoes sank into dampened grass. A champagne glass toppled, spilling its contents like a harbinger of the chaos to come. Guests paused, puzzled, looking around at each other, unsure if it was intentional or an accident. Marcus watched, sipping his coffee, as the water began to surge more decisively. The carefully manicured flower bed started to sway and bow under the pressure of the encroaching reservoir. Decorative fountains, intended to showcase the HOA's sense of luxury, sputtered and stuttered as water pooled around them. And then, the crescendo. The controlled flow transformed into a small but formidable wave, marching with quiet authority toward the main event. Guests shrieked and scrambled for safety. Servers abandoned trays mid-step, champagne bottles bobbing like tiny buoys. Cynthia's scream pierced the air as she witnessed her perfectly orchestrated afternoon turning into a waterlogged disaster. Marcus allowed himself a brief chuckle, knowing the poetic justice of it. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't vengeful in the traditional sense. But seeing the consequences of trying to control what wasn't yours, that was immensely satisfying. Through the binoculars, he could see Cynthia attempting to salvage her decorations, her elegant gloves soaked through, hair sticking to her face, makeup ruined. The water lapped at her perfectly arranged garden seating, sending umbrellas and chairs sliding across the sodden lawn. Nearby neighbors had emerged, cameras in hand, capturing every moment for social media. Soon, the entire community would witness the spectacle. Marcus's careful calculations had ensured safety, but the spectacle was undeniable. It wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a statement. The HOA, the president, and anyone who thought they could dictate terms over his land were about to learn a lesson they wouldn't forget. As the water crested the garden, Marcus reflected on the irony. The same entity they had fined him for owning too much water, was now the protagonist of their afternoon drama. Nature, with quiet impartiality, had delivered justice. And Cynthia? She stood at the center, soaked, furious, yet utterly powerless. Marcus knew words wouldn't help now, only observation, and the realization of the absurdity of her own actions. By the time the last of the water receded, guests were scattered, laughter mingling with shock and exclamations. The HOA's garden party, the pride of their social calendar, lay in disarray. Marcus lowered the sluice gate, the lake calm once again, reflecting the evening sun like nothing had happened. For Marcus, it wasn't just about embarrassment, it was about control, boundaries, and respect. The HOA had tried to impose authority over what belonged to him. Today, the lake reminded them that some things were simply beyond human control. By the following morning, the neighborhood was buzzing like an electric wire. Videos of the flooded garden party had gone viral within hours. Smartphones captured champagne flutes floating across soggy lawns, toppled umbrellas, and Cynthia Whitmore's drenched, disbelieving expression. Social media was ablaze with commentary, some applauding Marcus' cleverness, others mocking the HOA's incompetence. Inside the clubhouse, the HOA was in chaos. Members whispered nervously, unsure who to blame or how to respond. Cynthia, however, remained at the center of attention, her frustration boiling over. She had spent months cultivating her image as the composed, unchallenged authority of the community, and now her signature event had been undone by a man they had fined for owning too much water. Marcus, meanwhile, had watched the unfolding drama from his property, serene as ever. His plan had succeeded without harm or legal repercussions. The water was on his land, released in a controlled manner, and no laws had been broken. Yet, he knew a confrontation with Cynthia was inevitable. Her pride and sense of authority demanded it. True to form, Cynthia stormed across the sodden grass, approaching Marcus' property line. Her designer shoes were soaked, gloves muddy, but her glare remained sharp, razor-edged. "You think this is funny?" she spat, voice trembling with rage. "You ruined my garden party. Do you have any idea what this cost me? What you've done is..." Marcus held up a hand, cutting her off with calm authority. "I don't think it's funny, Cynthia. I think it's educational." Cynthia's brow furrowed. "Educational?" "Yes," Marcus replied evenly, stepping closer but keeping a safe distance. "You fine me for what I legally own. My property, my reservoir, my dam. You thought you could dictate terms over water that isn't yours. Now, you've seen the consequences of that kind of control." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Cynthia's eyes, once sharp with confidence, flickered with disbelief. Marcus continued, his voice calm, measured. "Power isn't about rules, certificates, or fines. It's about respect. And respect is earned, not imposed." Neighbors gathered, some discreetly, some openly filming. The community buzzed with whispers. The message was clear: Marcus Reynolds had outmaneuvered the HOA without breaking laws, without resorting to petty revenge, and without harming anyone. Cynthia, drenched and humbled, clenched her fists. She wanted to argue, to demand recompense, to reassert authority, but Marcus' calm and rational stance left her without footing. "You," she started, faltering, "you can't just..." "I can," Marcus interrupted gently. "Because it's mine, and because I acted within the law. Let this be a lesson: control is an illusion when you disregard the boundaries of others." The neighborhood murmured agreement. Some residents, impressed, nodded subtly. Others, still in disbelief, watched quietly, understanding that Marcus had delivered more than a personal victory. He had delivered a statement on fairness, boundaries, and dignity. Cynthia's shoulders slumped, a rare crack in her armor. For the first time, she realized that influence and authority could be countered by intelligence, patience, and a clever understanding of natural law. Marcus didn't need confrontation to win, he had already done so quietly, deliberately, and undeniably. As Cynthia turned to retreat, Marcus allowed himself a small, private smile. The garden party was ruined, yes, but in its destruction lay a lesson for the entire community. Some boundaries, once crossed, cannot be repaired by fines, rules, or pride alone. Respect and fairness, however, could never be replaced by arrogance. Marcus returned to his lake, the water calm and reflective. The incident was over, but its echoes would ripple for weeks. Neighbors whispered about his cleverness, the viral videos circulated endlessly, and the HOA faced questions they could not answer. Marcus' point had been made: nature, law, and intellect together could outmaneuver arrogance, but only if wielded with precision and integrity. The calm had returned to the lake, but Marcus knew that power, responsibility, and respect were always in flux. He had chosen his method of teaching a lesson carefully, and now, the lesson would be remembered. Days after the garden party debacle, the neighborhood buzz had shifted from gossip to reflection. Smartphones were still alive with clips of champagne bottles bobbing in the water and the shocked faces of the HOA members. Marcus Reynolds, however, had returned to his usual routine. The lake was calm again, the dam secure, and the mist rose over the water as if nothing had happened. But Marcus knew better, the ripples of his actions would continue to spread far beyond the reservoir. Cynthia Whitmore had retreated from public view, nursing bruised pride and the undeniable lesson that authority built on arrogance could crumble under the weight of reason. She issued a formal apology to the HOA, though carefully worded to save face, and the fine against Marcus was rescinded. The community was forced to acknowledge that the water had been legally his all along. Neighbors approached Marcus over the next few days. Some congratulated him quietly, admiration flickering in their eyes. Others offered polite smiles tinged with envy. Children waved from the streets, fascinated by the lake that had become the site of a legendary showdown. Marcus accepted these gestures with his usual calm, but he didn't seek fame or recognition. His satisfaction was private, a quiet acknowledgement that justice, when wielded thoughtfully, could be elegant and effective. One evening, Marcus walked the familiar path along the water's edge. The sun dipped low, casting long golden shadows across the lake. The air smelled of wet grass and pine, the same way it had before the incident, serene yet charged with memory. He reflected on the events that had unfolded, not just the chaos at the garden party, but the deeper truths revealed in its aftermath. Power, he realized, was fragile when it relied solely on rules and intimidation. Respect, fairness, and understanding, however, were enduring. Cynthia's actions had reminded him of the importance of boundaries, not only those that protected him, but those he needed to respect in others, even when they had crossed lines. It was a lesson in balance, patience, and the subtle art of demonstrating principles without resorting to cruelty. As he stood at the dock, Marcus looked out at the calm water. It was his domain, a sanctuary of reflection and quiet power. The HOA could try to regulate appearances, enforce rules, or fine the innocent, but some things, he realized, could never be contained. Water, like integrity and truth, always finds its way. In the following weeks, the community settled into a new equilibrium. Cynthia Whitmore continued her HOA duties, but with a humbler approach. Neighborhood events resumed, this time with a subtle awareness of boundaries and respect. And Marcus? He continued his walks along the lake, coffee in hand, enjoying the simple pleasure of morning mist curling around him. He smiled faintly at the memory of the chaos, the lesson delivered without anger, without damage, but with unmistakable clarity. The lake remained calm, but its presence reminded everyone who passed by, some things are beyond control, and those who attempt to impose power unjustly may find themselves humbled in the most unexpected ways. Marcus turned, heading back toward his house as the sun set in brilliant hues of orange and pink. The community had learned its lesson, Cynthia most of all. And Marcus Reynolds, as always, had acted with integrity, intelligence, and the quiet satisfaction of one who understands the true value of ownership, respect, and subtle justice. The calm had returned, but the story of the lake, and the garden party that had been washed away, would be remembered for years to come. Marcus had proven that cleverness, patience, and a deep understanding of one's own resources could deliver justice more effectively than anger or confrontation ever could. And somewhere in the gentle ripple of his private lake, the echo of that lesson lingered: attempt to control what isn't yours, and the consequences, when delivered with care, can be both inevitable and unforgettable.